Once upon a time, there was a little girl in a village. She was very well liked by everyone, but no one loved her quite as much as her grandmother, who made her a beautiful red cloak. Because the girl loved to wear the red cloak everywhere, she was called Little Red Riding Hood. One day, her mother woke her, saying, "Your grandmother is feeling ill. I want you to take these bread and chocolates to her to help her feel better." Little Red Riding Hood agreed because she also loved her grandmother and wanted her to feel better. But before she left, her mother grabbed her hand and in a stern voice reminded her, "Now, Little Red Riding Hood, remember that this is just a story. There's no inherent lesson in it and no singular definitive source, so you must always be careful of people who tell you they know the true meaning." Hello everyone, and welcome to Tales of Our Times. This is a show where we discuss the stories that move us, what makes them so meaningful, and why others could or should find meaning in them as well. We cover books, movies, comics, and more. Where there's a story, there's a reason to read. I'm your host, Amanda Stevens, and welcome to another Takes of Our Time, a recurring segment on Tales of Our Time where instead of discussing a single story that moves us, we discuss an aspect of storytelling and delve into greater detail to better understand how they shape the stories that shape us. I promise we'll get back to our regular format episodes soon, but I've been cooking up even more collaborations for 2026, so in the meantime, I wanted to take a little bit more time to go over some story concepts with you all. Following the thematic footsteps of last week's episode, we're going to take a look at one of my favorite genres of story, the fairy tale. But more importantly, I want to spend some time to scrutinize one of the core elements many people associate with fairy tales, the idea of the moral. I mentioned offhandedly last week that fairy tales are, in my opinion, great for both adults and children, and I got some surprising feedback asking about what I meant by that, and referencing one version or another as the original. So I thought it would be a good idea to interrogate those ideas with you here today. But before we get started, I want to lay out that I'm not necessarily trying to prove anyone wrong. Rather, I hope to offer a perspective which might invite you to think more deeply about stories that we usually look at as pretty one-dimensional. We'll be using a little bit of theory, but I'll break it down as we go, and just to make sure the episode doesn't get too pedagogical, we'll be using the story of Little Red Riding Hood throughout. Even having said that, this isn't a spoiler-free show, and while many people know how Little Red Riding Hood goes, we may discuss some spoilers from various adaptations across the years, so bear that in mind as you continue listening. Now, enough signposting, and let's get started. As always, let's start by defining what we're talking about. In this case, the fairy tale. A definition I've always used is that fairy tales are stories that can be about anything, have no time or place, and where magic is normal. So let's break those pieces down even further. When I say fairy tales can be about anything, I mean the protagonist of a fairy tale may be a pig, a little girl or boy, a prince or princess, and sometimes even inanimate objects, such as a talking sausage. These examples can be seen in the stories of The Three Little Pigs, Hansel and Gretel, The Princess and the Pea, and The Mouse, the Bird, and the Sausage. For the next part, I would ask you to think for a moment about where and when each of those stories take place. I'll give you a second. Did you get stuck or only think of Once Upon a Time in a Castle Far, Far Away? Well, that's what I mean when I say fairy tales don't have a time or a place. Of the fairy tales I listed before, 2 take place in a forest, and 1 in a castle or kingdom. But none of those places have specific names or dates attached to them. Compared to legends like that of Dracula, King Arthur, or the Ballad of Mulan, which all have a pretty well-defined sense of both place and time, fairy tales tend to be nebulous, happening far away from us in a time somewhere before now. The last part, magic is normal, is a little trickier, but it basically means that in the world of fairy tales, both readers and characters don't usually question the strange things that happen to them. In The Three Little Pigs, for example, we don't usually question how the pigs can build houses, how they can talk, or how a wolf can blow them down. Further, none of the usually human vendors selling straws, sticks, and bricks seem surprised to speak to a pig or sell them their wares. It's accepted as a normal thing of life. The same goes for the princess and the pea. Why did she feel the pea? Because she's a princess, no other explanation needed. Or basically everything that happens in The Mouse, the Bird, and the Sausage, although perhaps the standouts are the fact that they can all talk to each other and they create a communal living situation. However, unlike in myths, magical occurrences don't have to be tied to a higher power. They can be, such as the case with a fairy godparent, but even then, the characters rarely ask where the fairy godmother came from, how long she's been around, or why she didn't intervene before. So there you have it. Fairy tales are stories about anything with no time or place where magic is normal. Other characteristics may include that these stories are usually old and without a single author, but that's not always true. Similarly, many fairy tales over the years have had a moral at the end and have been intended for children, which are two of the ideas we're going to discuss today, though the spoiler would be that that's not always true either. Finally, fairy tales are a type of folklore, which is a kind of catch-all for stories from any particular community, which are often passed down through generations by word of mouth. Who the folk in folklore is, though, is up for debate. That's going to be our jumping off point into our questions of what exactly, if anything, these stories mean. With fairy tales, it's theoretically very easy to figure out what they mean, since so many have a moral directly written into the story. The genre of the folktale has a long history of being used to teach lessons, and beginning in the 19th century, they were even tailored specifically for children's education. But tracing the versions of fairy tales and the differences between both the morals, stories, and author interpretations can quickly start to feel like a game of telephone gone wrong. When we're looking for the true or right meaning of a story, one of the first places we usually look is at the author and what their intentions were when writing the story. Of course, that gets complicated with fairy tales very quickly because many don't have a single author, and even published versions are based on much older oral storytelling traditions. This leads many of us to the question, what was the message of the original story, and who has the right to say that it's so? To explore this idea, let's return back to the story of Little Red Riding Hood. It's probably been a while since you last heard it, so we'll take a break from the questions and theory, and I'll tell you the version that I was told as a child. Once upon a time, there was a little girl in a village. She was very well liked by everyone, but no one loved her quite as much as her grandmother, who made a beautiful red cloak for her. Because the girl loved to wear the cloak everywhere she went, she was called Little Red Riding Hood. One day, her mother woke her, saying, "Your grandmother is feeling ill. I want you to take her these cakes to help her feel better." Little Red Riding Hood agreed because she also loved her grandmother and wanted her to feel better. But before she left, her mother grabbed her hand and, in a stern voice, reminded her to stay on the path and not to stop to talk to strangers. Little Red Riding Hood set out immediately for her grandmother, who lived in another village. As she was going through the woods, she met a great big wolf, who decided he wanted to eat her up. He asked her where she was going. The poor child, who did not know that it was dangerous to speak to wolves, said to him, "I'm going to see my grandmother and give her some cakes." "Does she live far off?" asked the wolf. "Oh, yes," answered Little Red Riding Hood. "The first house you come to in the next village." "Well," said the wolf, "then I'll go see her too. I'll go this way and you go that way, and we shall see who will be the first to get there." The wolf began to run as fast as he could, taking the shortest route, and the little girl went the longest route, while gathering nuts, running after butterflies, and smelling all the little flowers she saw. It wasn't long before the wolf reached the old woman's house. The wolf quickly ran inside and ate up Red's grandma in no time at all, for he had not eaten anything in more than 3 days. He then shut the door, went into the grandmother's bed, and waited for Little Red Riding Hood, who came sometime afterward and knocked at the door 3 times. "Who's there?" called the wolf. Little Red Riding Hood, hearing the big voice of the wolf, was at first afraid, but thinking her grandmother had a cold, answered, "It's your grandchild, Little Red Riding Hood, who has brought you some cakes sent to you by Mother." The wolf cried out to her, softening his voice a little, "Open the door, it's not locked." Little Red Riding Hood opened the door and came in. The wolf had hidden himself in the grandmother's nightgown in the bed. "Put the cakes on the stool and come over to the bed with me." Little Red Riding Hood did just that and went over to the bed, where she was much surprised to see how her grandmother looked in her nightclothes. She said to her, "Grandma, what big ears you have." "All the better to hear you with, my child." "Grandma, what big eyes you have." "All the better to see you with, my child." "Grandma, what big teeth you have." "All the better to eat you up." And saying these words, this wicked wolf jumped upon Little Red Riding Hood and ate her all up. The end. Unfortunately, I don't remember who wrote that version, but I do distinctly remember discussing the moral with the other young children in kindergarten. Can you guess what it was supposed to teach? There are, of course, many different versions of this story. In some, Little Red and her grandmother live, cut out of the wolf's stomach by a friendly woodcutter walking by. Sometimes she doesn't even get eaten at all, but escapes. These details and the meaning of the story as a whole are important when we look at these stories, as I did, as teaching materials. Folklore and fairy tales have been used at least since the 18th century to teach and reinforce values that a society prizes, or as tales of warning. Stories like Little Red Riding Hood have been interpreted to mean all kinds of things over the years, from simply "don't go into the woods" to a metaphor for a woman's coming of age. To that end, if we continue to use them as teaching materials, it does, to some extent, matter which lesson we're pulling from the material, especially when we use them for young children. And this leads us back to the author and author intent. As I said before, fairy tales are part of the larger genre of folklore. So who are the folk responsible for these stories? In his essay, Yours, Mine, or Ours? PERRAULT, the Brothers Grimm, and the Ownership of Fairy Tales, writer Donald Haase asserts that there are largely 2 tendencies when it comes to trying to assign a story to a certain folk. The first is the instinct to assign folklore an ethnic or national identity. We can see this in the famous Brothers Grimm collection of fairy tales, meant to consolidate the folklore of post-Napoleonic Germany into a single identity. But there are several pitfalls with this way of organizing folk, the biggest being that it ignores or minimizes the ways in which people and cultures bleed between borders and evolve over time. For example, Haase points out that more recent scrutiny has revealed that many of Grimm's cultural informants for the stories were educated women from the French bourgeoisie who had relocated to Germany, meaning that many of these quintessentially German folktales cannot be thought of as so purely German as previously claimed. On the opposite end, many other folklorists over the years have viewed fairy tale and folklore in a sort of universalist way, meaning that the stories share timeless, universal human truths. This train of thought would mean that the folk were all humans across all time. And while I personally think this is closer to the truth, it also tends to fall apart, especially when folklore is employed as a teaching or social reinforcement tool, because it implies that we will all get the same universal meaning and value from the same stories, which just doesn't happen. Some examples of this have been found in Little Red Riding Hood. The version I told you before, that was supposed to teach me not to talk to strangers. But the surprisingly similar version by the French writer PERRAULT also has a moral affixed to the end, which reads, quote, "Children, especially attractive, well-bred young ladies, should never talk to strangers, for if they should do so, they may well provide dinner for a wolf. I say wolf, but not all wolves are exactly the same. Some are perfectly charming, not loud, brutal, or angry, but tame, pleasant, and gentle, following young ladies right into their homes and chambers. But watch out if you haven't learned that tame wolves are the most dangerous of all." End quote. And yes, he really wrote all of that as a moral. Still, even from these two examples, it's clear that we drew very different conclusions from the same story. Universalism also tends to ignore the social and historical contexts for how values are assigned. Frankly, even the term folk can be somewhat problematic, as it has often been described over the years somewhat insultingly as simple people without big ideas, untouched by and uninterested in larger political and cultural movements. This salt of the earth myth assigns an authenticity to this theoretical people balanced on their naivety and ignorance of the world at large, which again is often untrue. So, who are the folk of folktale? If not from a particular region and not the universal human experience, who is responsible and who is able to say what these stories mean? There is no definitive answer, but my opinion is that it's somewhere in between all of these answers. I tend toward the definition of folk as any group of people that share more than one characteristic in common with differing levels of depth. When we look at the meaning in stories and morals that they so frankly espouse, it's important for us to remember the context in which they existed, both culturally and historically. Though that's not to say that old morals can't have value today, but it would be to say that we should interrogate them and not necessarily take them at face value. It would also mean that we shouldn't take the original as the best. Fairy tales of any version and any age shouldn't be treated as sacred texts, immune from alteration or diluted by retellings and reworkings. Rather, we should treat these as living stories. If they're vehicles for meaning and lessons, then it's okay to update them to fit our modern needs. That's what we've always done with them. In fact, the versions of Little Red Riding Hood we often hold up as unchanged or unadulterated are now believed to be the cleaned-up version of an even older oral tale called The Story of Grandmother, in which Little Red, not so young, escapes the wolf by using a striptease and threatening to pee in the bed. The Story of Grandmother has no moral and isn't intended to be anything other than an outrageous tale to pass the time. We molded it to fit our needs in the 19th century and in the 20th century, and we will continue to do so with this and every other story meant to teach a lesson. I'll leave you by reading another favorite version of Little Red Riding Hood, called The Girl and the Wolf by James Thurber, first published in 1940. Somewhat of a parody that I think encapsulates this idea of updating stories to fit our values perfectly. One afternoon, a big wolf waited in a dark forest for a little girl to come along carrying a basket of food to her grandmother. Finally, a little girl did come along, and she was carrying a basket of food. "Are you carrying that basket to your grandmother?" asked the wolf. The little girl said yes, she was. The wolf asked her where her grandmother lived, and the little girl told him, and he disappeared into the wood. When the little girl opened the door of her grandmother's house, she saw that there was somebody in bed with a nightcap and nightgown on. She had approached no nearer than 25 feet from the bed when she saw that it was not grandmother, but the wolf. For even in a nightcap, a wolf does not look any more like her grandmother than the Metro Goldwyn lion looks like Calvin Coolidge. So the little girl took an automatic out of her basket and shot the wolf dead. Moral: it is not so easy to fool little girls nowadays as it used to be. That's it for today's episode. This has been Tales of Our Time on Radio Taiwan International, and I was your host, Amanda Stevens. We'll be back next week with more stories and the meaning we've made from them. So, in the meantime, keep reading, keep questioning, and we'll see you next time.